Everybody. John Blazon here with the Spire Collection, Master Sommelier. In just a moment, we're going to be joined by Chris Carpenter. He is our mountaineer in Napa Valley, and he's going to join us. We're going to talk all things Merlot today. So I hope you're ready for a great exchange and hearing from Chris on his thoughts about this grape that's clawing back into prodigy where it belongs, especially in California. So hang with us in just a few moments. We'll be with Chris. Hey, Chris. Hi, Chris.
How are you?
Good to see you, Chris. We've got a great group here that are going to enjoy the next 30 minutes or so to hear about your thoughts about Merlot. As I was mentioning, you are our Napa mountaineer, working with the great blocks on 4 mountains and crafting the award-winning wines of La Jolla, Cardinal, Caladan, Mount Brave, La Jolla, and a little side projects in South Australia, Hickenbotham. But before we get into it, Chris, and we've got some questions we want to get your thoughts on. Can you tell us a little bit about your early experiences with Merlot when you first really came to appreciate the grape, where that was perhaps, and as a wine drinker and now as a winemaker, what your thoughts might be?
Well, I think the first place I learned about Merlot intimately was making Cardinal. So, I make several wines in the Napa Valley, and Cardinal has always had a portion of it from our Keys Vineyard on Howell Mountain. And the Merlot that we get, we make 2 Merlots, one that goes into Cardinal, the other that's a very high-end Merlot under La Jolla, not the Merlot we're tasting today, the WS Keys Vineyard Designate, but the 2 blocks that are up there were the first 2 blocks that actually sourced the Duckhorn Merlot back when Duckhorn had their killer Merlot program going. And I remember drinking those wines back in the 90s in Chicago, where I'm from, and thinking, man, these are awesome wines. And then, fast forward 7, 8 years later, and I'm making wines from those exact blocks, and I could see, intimately why they were so good. And that knowing that they were that good, and that we had one of the great areas in California for Merlot, that inspired me ultimately to present to our owner, Jess Jackson, who has since passed, the idea of creating a Merlot for La Jolla. I'm a firm believer in the variety. And, subsequent to all this, I've tasted Merlots from around the world. You think of Pomerol, you think of Bulgari, Saint-Emilion. I mean, you think of the 2000 vintage in Saint-Emilion. These are mind-blowing, good Merlots that are aging forever. There is no, and I've mentioned this in many seminars that you sat in on, John, there is no reason that the French and Italians should own the Merlot category. And by Italy, I mean Masetto. California, we talked about Australia recently. Those have places that we can grow really good Merlot in. And that, for me, I'm also a very competitive person, an ex-athlete. I guess that's in my genes. And I want people to understand that we can do it as good as anybody else. And we've got places in Napa Valley, on Howell Mountain with La Jolla, on Mount Vita with Mount Brave, and Spring Mountain. You think of our brands and the Merlot that comes for now Caladan, and then Paloma's been making killer Spring Mountain Merlots for a lot of years up there. So.
You get to source from Diamond, Spring, and Vita, a little bit of Merlot from Vita as well. Is there something distinctive about, you mentioned those 2 blocks for Keys and La Jolla, but is there something distinctive for Howell Mountain that our viewers might learn?
Yeah, Yes, and it's the same thing that you would realize if you were tasting Cabernets from each one of those places. There's a different textural component. Let's use Viter as our counterpoint. With Viter, the texture is more about this background or backbone tannin and this lift by way of the backbone, and then the high acid lift. It creates a much more like angular expression, whereas Howell Mountain it hits your palate across every portion of your palate and gives you this velvet and depth and crushed mineral character that is unique from a textural standpoint. Then you've got the minerality differences. The minerality on Viter tends to be like wet shale after a rainstorm. The minerality on Howell Mountain tends to be crushed gravel. That if you're pounding rocks apart with a sledgehammer, which I don't do that often, but you can get that dust gets in your nostril. That's what you get when you're getting the minerality off of Howell Mountain. And then you've got blue fruit and floral aspects on Viter, where you've got black fruit and herbal characters on Howell Mountain. And those all are expressed under the guise of either Cabernet or, in our case today, Merlot, with those Merlot characters that you would expect. And that's, my job is to make wines a place and to give people that ability to explore. We make a Merlot from Mount Brave. And if you were to put those two wines together, you would never confuse the two, but you would notice that you would know that they're Merlots, but that they have a unique character based on that place.
Often we see Cabernet Sauvignon sometimes as a soloist and complemented by other Bordeaux varieties. And Merlot is a soloist. I don't know if we've ever come across too many examples, but in this 2017 that we're tasting and sharing right now, you've got I think it's 11% Petit Verdot. Can you share with us when you were doing your trials where the Petit Verdot light bulb went off and said, this is what this wine needs?
Yeah, so this has become one of the signatures of Merlot. Actually, with our Merlot, one of the signatures of my Merlots, we don't do it up on Viter, but with this wine, I just love the Petit Verdot from Howell Mountain. I love the savory characters that Petit Verdot brings to the table. I love that black pepper character, and I love the tannins. They're very different than Merlot tannins. Merlot tannins tend to be broad. Petit Verdot tannins tend to be focused. And when you put the two together, it creates a different level of complexity. And then you have that savory character of the Petit Verdot blending with the more sweet fruit character of the Merlot, and they balance one another. It's sweet and sour, that great combination, like chocolate and pretzels. Those two things go really well together. Merlot and Petit Verdot do much the same thing for me.
How much of the Keys vineyard block actually went into this particular 2017 Lahota? Because I know you used it for Cardinal as well.
Yeah, that's a good question, John. And really, the Merlot that we're tasting today, which isn't the WX Keys Merlot, it's the Lahota Merlot. That Merlot is a collection of a block over our Lahota vineyard, which is very red fruit driven, and then several blocks, including a little bit from the Keys block that goes into WS Keys, but mostly from our other blocks. That WS Keys Merlot is directed to the collector. It's a wine that you're going to age for a very long time. It's got 20% Cabernet. It's a powerhouse. I'm trying to make a Merlot with this Merlot that we're tasting today, that has all of the characters of a Howell Mountain Merlot, and that will age. Frankly, I think all of our wines age really well, but that you can actually wrap your hands around a little bit earlier. And so utilizing some of that Jota Merlot right down the road, which tends to be really sweet and red, and not a lot of big tannins, with some of the Merlots on Howell. And then, backboning it with the Petit Verdot gives you a different expression.
When you're finishing your wine and you're deciding your oak regime for Merlot, is there something that you think about for Merlot as opposed to your decisions for your other varietals?
That's a really good question, and one that I'm thinking about right now, because as we're starting a new project that might have some Merlot in it. So Merlot is not a variety that will, if you put too much oak on that, it will show that. And if you put the wrong kind of oak, if it's got a toast level, because of that toastiness, there's a lot of delicacy to Merlot. And if you're not careful with the addition of the oak, because oak is a tool that we winemakers use to fill gaps and to enhance flavor. It's not meant to take over flavor. So whereas I use with Cabernet medium plus toasted barrels, and that may not mean a lot if you don't have experience with that, but with Merlot, I use medium toasted barrels. So there's not as much toastiness. There's more of that sweet vanilla character that comes through. You have to be somewhat careful with medium barrels though, because they can also show some raw oak because they don't go through that same toasting process. So I don't use as much oak typically by way of percentage that I would with Cabernet. And that's the thing with Merlot. I think the problem with Merlot has been, there's been a number of challenges throughout the history of Merlot in California. The first major one was that for a while, it was planted in the wrong places. And when it was planted in these places, it was grown in a way that wouldn't enhance it. It was grown just to produce it. But Merlot is real finicky. It's easy to grow, but hard to grow at a high level, if that makes sense. So you have to be able to farm it correctly. You can't leave a lot of crop on the vine. You can't let a lot of leaf area cover the fruit. The fruit needs sunlight. And a lot of people weren't doing that. And they planted in places that never got a lot of sun, like the Carneros in Napa. If you can do that, then you create this base character of depth, of complexity, of floral notes, and then you take it to the next step. Well, how are you, after you ferment it, how are you matching it with the oak? Well, you have to be as sensitive to the differences in the growing capacity of Merlot as you are in the winemaking capacity, because it is different, and that comes through trial and error, frankly. The great thing about that Merlot that goes into Cardinal is it's almost like a cab drinker's Merlot. But not all the Merlot that we have up there is that way. So you experiment, which is what we did. We ran a lot of trials over a lot of years to dial in exactly what you asked. What is the right oak percentage? And I think we've gotten pretty close. We tweak all the time as we experiment and learn new things. But I think we're pretty close to how it should be operated out of those two vineyards, at least.
Yeah, and 2017 was a very unique growing season and disastrous towards the end. I think that the Merlot grape that you could expand upon, was benefited by the early ripening and be able to brought in between the events that precluded the Cabernet. And this particular bottling of 2017 La Jota, I think, is it possible to suggest that it benefited from some extra block activity from other sources that it may not have received before?
Well, and I don't know if that's the case. I think in the case of 17, You know, we didn't make a lot of wine in 17, and we don't have a Cabernet from Lahota in 17. We just have this Merlot. What happened before the fires of 17 was one of the more ideal vintages I'd experienced in a long time. You know, in Napa, we, up until recently with these fires, but we have always benefited from having very consistent vintages year after year as far as our weather patterns. And, you know, well, let's say 6 out of 10 vintages are super good. You know, they're just 6 out of 10. That's still pretty good. 2 out of 10 are outstanding, and then the other two, maybe those are the weak ones. But this was one of those 2 out of 10 outstanding vintages up until the fires. And because of that, things ripened at a rate that was ideal across all of the individual blocks. And we could pick at ideal spots. And we've got a couple of Merlot blocks up there that pick a little bit earlier. Merlot typically ripens a little bit earlier. One of the reasons it does well on a place like Howell Mountain, that's pretty cold appellation. So we were able to bring that fruit in an ideal setting, an ideal vintage. And thankfully we had enough of that in, and again, we didn't make a lot. I'm typically around with Merlot about 1,000 cases now. I think in 17 we made like 500, something like that. So we didn't make as much as we've made in the past, but all the fruit that I had and ultimately all the wine that I had was the high quality. It would have been, again, I think one of the great vintages of the teens, probably right up there at 12 and 13. But then we had our little event.
Chris, we had a question come in. For those that may not be as familiar with the history of Lahota, you joined in 2005. Could you just give us a brief, the history of Lahota?
Yeah, it's got a great history. It's so going back to the late 1800s, the property was owned by George Yount. George Yount later had a town named Yountville named after him that Thomas Keller made famous by opening the French Laundry in. George was a cattle rancher, and he also had horses. And at one point, a number of Swiss, for whatever reason, Swiss decided to move to Napa. A lot of the wineries on the valley floor actually were opened by Swiss Italians. This guy named Frederick Hess, who was Swiss German, landed up on Howell Mountain, checking out some real estate, and George sold them this piece. And Frederick Hess bought it because he recognized that this is an area that was very similar to some of the growing areas that he was accustomed to back in Europe. Right down the road, there was a guy named Keys that was farming up there. So he had somebody that he could utilize as a source of information. And he planted Lahota. And he ran Lahota from 1898 up until Prohibition. And then, like many of the great wineries that were around at that time, they couldn't make wine, they couldn't sell wine, so they went out of business. And that property remained fallow. He had built a great incredible winery up there that still exists to this day. But that, even having the winery and these great vineyards, it was fallow up until 1976, when a guy named Bill Smith came in and bought it from Hess's descendants and rebooted the Lahota brand and the vineyards and the winery, and operated out of this winery. Bill was up there about the exact same time that Randy Dunn got started with Dunn family. Helen Turley helped him for a little bit. There was just a lot of great people up there learning about Howell Mountain and banging the drum about Howell Mountain again. Bill ran it successfully up until 2000 and I think 2000 or 2001. And then he wanted to try a different project. He sold it to Markham. Markham owned it for about 3 years and then sold it to 4, and then sold it to us in 2005. And we still, throughout this whole history, that winery, this old stone winery, has been operating continuously, you know, with the exception of the Prohibition times, as a winery. It's one of the few ghost wineries in Napa that still operates, and we're very proud of that building. In fact, it must have been about 5-6 years ago now, we did the whole earthquake retrofit on it and gussied it all up, and it should be around for another 100 years. So hopefully after I'm long gone, somebody else will be up there operating out of it. And Howell Mountain in general is just a fabulous place to grow grapes. It's one of the cooler appellations. It's at the far northern end of the valley on the eastern side. A lot of the cold air that comes off of the bay heads up the valley and then jogs to the right over Howell Mountain, dragging a lot of that moisture and cold air with it. And it keeps this area at a temperature and then of an expression that has very similar characters to Bordeaux. I think it's our most Bordeaux-like appellation in Napa Valley. And the wines that you get there, I just adore Howell Mountain wines up and down the line. You know, under La Jota, not only do we make this Merlot, we make a Cab Franc, we make the Cabernet that I mentioned, we make the W.S. Keys Merlot, and recently we launched a Chardonnay, which is, you know, a very rare find on Howell Mountain to find a Chardonnay, because the cabs are so bloody good that it's really hard to justify having a Chardonnay up there when you could plant Cabernet and make a lot more money. But we have a Chardonnay that just is outstanding and really shows, you know, that cooler region for growing that kind of variety.
That's some great history right there. You know, as we wrap up, this particular wine, and I've tasted this a couple of times. I know you mentioned that, you know, sometimes the W.S. Keys might be confused as a steak lover's wine. I think this particular 2017 and all of your Merlots from La Jota for that matter, always over deliver this intensity, but yet this generous texture, as you were mentioning. And it, you know, for those that are probably on the fence and haven't tasted Merlot in a while, or maybe haven't discovered Mountain Merlot, I mean, I think this is an amazing value, you know, for the price value relationship of this wine to Cabernet counterparts. That in itself is worth the point of discovery. I think if you haven't had a chance to try La Jota Merlot or Merlot from mountains in general, I think, and there really aren't too many to speak of. I mean, there might be some that have been there for a while, but it's, as you've alluded, it's not easy to farm on mountains. I mean, the costs associated are very high, comparable to the valley floor, but there's always that extra lift. And in tasting this wine, there's also that refreshing acidity. I don't think we talk about acid out of red wines as much as we could from mountains. Can you just briefly touch on why we're getting so much refreshing acidity out of your wines from the mountains?
So one of the effects that happens on the mountains is what's called the diurnal effect, diurnal shift. And what that means is in the late afternoon, when the winds start coming off the bay, they hit the mountains first and they cool the mountains down. And the acid reactions are driven by heat. So you have a drop in acid over the course of the growing season because of the accumulation of heat over that growing season. Well, if you have a cooling effect, it slows that reaction down. So you don't drop your acids out. Your acids are maintained. And Howell Mountain, Bitter, Diamond Spring, they all get this effect in different levels depending on where they're at, but it maintains the acid that way, which, acid to winemakers is like salt to chefs, and it gives that lift on all the fruit characters. And we're, part of mountain winemaking and mountain farming is the knowledge that you are not going to be adding a lot of acid in the fermenter, that there's a lot of natural acid that carries, and that acid expression also is part of how each one of these sub-appellations in Napa are defined. And we're very fortunate to have these places.
Great. Well, I know you've been running back to back on these interviews here, so we might just, unless there's any specific questions from the audience, now would be the time to chime in and ask Chris a question that might be on your mind about Merlot, about this specific bottling. I corvined mine, but I might have to open the whole thing up with a steak tonight. It's absolutely fantastic, and it's just an amazing example of what can be grown on the mountain, from Howell Mountain, from La Jota, under Chris's tutelage. But Chris, if you're going to open a Merlot these days, and it's not necessarily going to be from the United States, is there a favorite in Europe or Italy that you like to go to?
I absolutely love Masetto wines. I've had the great opportunity to visit that vineyard and taste probably, 10 different vintages of that wine. And it never disappoints for me. And I think it really expresses that place as good of any wine that I've ever tasted. That would be my go-to. So.
Fantastic.
And John, just so
yeah.
I'm going to be tasting with Drew Bledsoe on Saturday. Maybe I'll see if he can bring down one of his Merlots, and I can tell him all about all my Boston friends and what goes on with hero worship.
He's got some pretty impressive hillside Walla Walla food. I had the pleasure of meeting Drew when I was out there when I was with Disney, and I was celebrity struck, and he's a big guy.
He's a good guy. Yeah, he's a really good guy.
The two of you will square off neatly. I mean, you might throw a couple of passes there, but that should be a great tasting night. I'm a little envious.
My inclination, but John, I was a defensive lineman. My inclination is to tackle him every time.
Well said. Well, Chris, thanks very much for your time. Everybody, I hope you put a La Jota Merlot in your glass of 2017. It's tasting absolutely stunning. It's one to enjoy now. Buy a case or two, put it in your cellar, and please come out and visit Chris and everybody. We'd love to see you in Napa Valley soon. So thanks, Chris, again for your time, and everybody have a great day.
You as well, John. Thank
Cheers.
you. Thank you, Oscar.